I just completed my junior year in high school. I had a pocket full of quarters, and I was getting ready to hop on my bike and go play some video games. Just then, my mom called me back in the house. I could tell by the tone of her voice, whatever she wanted to talk to me about was serious. And I was a pretty good kid. I knew that I didn't do anything wrong, so I wasn't in trouble. But nonetheless, I knew whenever I went back in the house and sat down on the couch, my life would change forever. So I walked back in, sat on the couch. My mom looked at me what seemed to be an eternity. She took a deep breath and said, "Son, you just completed your junior year in high school. I'm giving you a 1-year advance notice. When you graduate from Ross S. Sterling next year, you'll become 18 years old and you will have to leave the house. You will have to go out there and become a man. You will no longer have me to provide food, clothing, shelter, or anything. You will be on your own." Good morning, everyone. My name is Ray, and I'm here to tell you about my decision to join the United States Army. I would do so in 3 points. Main point 1, the events that caused me to join the Army. I'll just go into more detail. Main point 2, the decision of me actually being in the Army. And main point 3, the outcomes of me being in the Army. My executive summary is that based on events, when you have to make a decision, think long and hard so that the outcomes will be positive. I'm going to stop right now and ask, are there any questions? There has to be some questions. We won't go on until someone asks me a question. So questions based on what I've gone on so far. Somebody asked me a question because we have to ask. There you go. Yes.
Why did you choose the Army?
Very good question. Originally, I wanted to go to the Air Force because I thought it was easier. But every time I went to the Air Force recruiting office, he was gone. He was out to lunch. And so I talked to the Marine guy, and he was offering me a cook or a band, and I didn't want to be a cook. I didn't play an instrument, and I don't like the water. And so that basically left the Army by default. But that was a very good question. Another question. One more question before I move on to my first one. Yes?
Did you know anyone who was in the Army when you were younger?
Very good question. No. This was not like a family decision. A lot of families have fathers and grandfathers that were in the military. I only had one cousin that joined the military before me. This came out of nowhere. I had no plans of joining the military at all until my mom said I had to leave the house, and I didn't do well on my SAT test, and I had to make a decision. I figured joining the military would give me a positive career, money for college, and I was a military police officer, and so whenever I decided to get out, I could ultimately be a police officer. Another question. All right, I'll move to my first point, the events that caused me to join the Army. As I said, my mom told me that I had to leave the house when I graduated from high school, but what I did not tell you was I was angry at her. For you see, my father, God rest his soul, he passed away in 1997, and toward the end of his life, we had a wonderful relationship. In fact, the very last day I saw him was on Father's Day. The very last thing that I said to him was, "I love you," and the very last thing I did was hug him, and unfortunately, he passed away of a sudden heart attack a couple of days later. But he wasn't there like he should have been whenever I was growing up. It was my mother who was both my mother and my father. It was my mother who every Christmas made certain that I had a tree and I had plenty of gifts. It was my mother every birthday made certain that there was a cake and a party. But more important than just giving me things, my mom taught me how to be a man. She taught me how to respect other individuals and treat them like I wanted them to treat me. So when she told me I had to leave the house, I was angry at her because I felt like she was abandoning me. But I thought I had to go because my mom had rheumatic fever when she was a little girl and her heart valve was leaking blood. Doctors told her she would be okay for a while, but eventually she would have to get a new valve, otherwise her life would be in danger. And that's what happened. It just got to the point where she was in so much pain, she was in so much discomfort that she had to go and have major surgery, and I had to go so that she could take care of herself. No problem. I thought, I'll go to college like all of my other friends. I'll take the SAT test. Ross S. Sterling was not the smartest kid by any stretch of the imagination, but I was a pretty good kid. Pretty smart, could make B's. High school wasn't too hard, but still I could throw up some B's every now and then an A. And so I thought if I took the SAT test, the highest score you could make was a 1,600. I figured I could make 1,000 and 1,100, and that would give me a lot of good selections to go to school in state and maybe even outside of state. But unfortunately, the very first time I took the test, I did not do that well. I made an extremely low combined 660. The median was 800. I scored about 140, 160 points below the median. I thought maybe I just had a bad day, and so I signed up to take the test again the night before. I got a good night's sleep, number 2 pencils, had a good breakfast, off to Lee High School, taking the test, and I felt like I did better, but unfortunately I did even worse. I made a combined 640, 20 points lower. I have dyslexia. I'm able to control it now, but back then I was not. B's started looking like D's, the words started running off of the page, and the proctor would say, you have 1 minute to complete the section, and I would panic and I would just start bubbling randomly, and the way they graded the SAT back then was the total number of questions based on the total number of questions you answered correctly. So me guessing that drug my score down. To make matters worse, my high school counselor looked at my score, looked me dead in the eye, and without any hesitation said, you are not college material. Before I go on to my second point, questions. We need some questions. Questions on anything I've gone over so far. Can't go on, yes, sir, go ahead.
So how did you feel about when that counselor told you that?
Very good question. Resented him. In fact, that resentment lasted until COVID, when I was by myself and I was forced to deal with resentments that I didn't think were necessary or were relevant. But I always thought, how dare you tell me that I wasn't college material? During COVID, I had to deal with it because that counselor doesn't know who I am. He isn't stuttering about, he may or may not even be alive. And so I resented him. I just worked through that resentment 30 some odd years ago during COVID, whenever I was forced to deal with a lot of resentments. So to answer your question, I resented him, but now I wish him well. Think you had a question?
Yeah, I was wondering, do you think the counselor would have had any regrets of saying that?
That's a very good question, and the answer is I don't think so, because I've been teaching here for 20 years, and I've been telling that story, and I had an individual tell me, that same counselor told me the exact same thing.
Wow.
And it threw her off course. And I was thinking, how many people weren't strong like that young female that told me that, or like me, and ultimately worked through that? How many people did he tell, and they ultimately just thought, I'm nothing, and they went on to obscurity? So I don't think he had any regret at all. That's why, as a teacher, I vow never to tell a student that they can't do something. I'll let them know you're gonna have to make some changes, but I'll never tell them that they can't do anything. That's a very good question. One other question before we move on. One other question before we move on to point number 2. Yes?
How did you avoid the feeling that you are nothing after that?
My mom. God rest my mom, so she passed away in 2018, and my mom always said, you can do whatever it is you wanted to. And then when I went to the Army, so even though I resented him, I used that resentment as a positive, because when I went to the Army, I said, I will never ever give up, and I'll show this individual. I never fell out of a march. I was always number 1 whenever it came to running and doing push-ups. So that anger that I had fueled me to be an outstanding soldier, and I even use that fuel today. I just don't have that same resentment. All right, excellent questions. I will now move on to point number 2. Now, even though I may stop and ask if there are questions, if you have any questions, in fact, during this next point, I want someone to raise their hand and, for lack of a better word, interrupt me, because this is how it's going to be in corporate America. So, my second point, actually being in the military. Very first thing that I did was KP, Kitchen Patrol. Yes.
I was just about to ask, what was KP?
Kitchen Patrol. You literally wash dishes, and what happens, you have to wait. Each company has about 4 platoons. Each platoon has 55 soldiers, and before you can start, you have to wait until it fills up. And so I got there in the beginning, and so I was in like the 2nd or 3rd platoon, and we had to wait a week or 2 for the 4th platoon to fill up before we could actually start training. And what you did in the interim, you washed dishes, or you went and you picked up garbage. You were like free labor for the military. And so KP stands for Kitchen Patrol. They woke me up at 0400, which is 4 a.m. for you non-military individuals, marched me to the chow hall, and they said, you wash these dishes and you don't stop until I tell you to stop. I'm the type of person, I don't like touching my own food. much less somebody else's half-eaten, discarded food. And so I'm scraping food off of plates. My hands are all red and itchy because of the water. And I go, Drill Sergeant, can I get some gloves? He goes, no, you can't have any gloves, soldier. What? Are your hands dry and itchy? What are you going to do when you're in a war? Are you going to ask for a timeout so that you can get some lotion on your hands? You wash these dishes until I tell you to stop. I am not going to lie. That first week and a half, and I only had it for a week and a half. There's some soldiers that had it for like a month. Most miserable that I ever had been in my entire life. More miserable than staying outside, yes.
You started at 4 in the morning. How long did that take?
We washed dishes until about 1800 the next day, which is like 6 p.m. So all day. Miserable, miserable. But fortunately, after KP was done, we started military training, and one of the fascinating things that I did was fire the M16. I never fired a weapon before I joined the military. The M16 was a weapon that all soldiers had to fire. It has a maximum effective range, at least when I was in, of 350 yards. That's over 3.5 football fields. It has a 5.56 millimeter armor piercing round, meaning if you have on some type of a bulletproof or Kevlar vest, this round will go straight through it. 3 settings on the M16. Safe, meaning as long as the weapon is on safe, you depress the trigger, nothing will happen. The second setting, semi-automatic, meaning as quick as you can depress the trigger, that is as quick as the rounds will be expelled from the rifle. And the third and final setting, and my most favorite setting, automatic, meaning as long as you have ammunition in the weapon and you lay on the trigger, rounds will be expelled from the rifle in this highly effective manner. I never fired a weapon in my life, so to see the destruction that I was causing downrange with my M16 was exhilarating. I love firing my M16. Alas, 2 years and 10 months passed, and I made the decision to actually get out. So this is going to bring me to my third and final point. Before I move on, are there any questions? Any questions before I move on to my third? Yes.
Why'd you decide to leave?
Very good question. When I was in the Army, toward the end, I went in front of the E5 board. It's a verbal board where they ask you questions, much like you guys are asking me now. The highest score you can make is a 200. Because I had discipline, because I used that resentment as fuel, I was an outstanding soldier. I took college classes while I was in because I wanted to prove to that counselor that I was wrong, that I could at least take one class and pass. So I took one class, made an A. I took another class, made an A. I took another class, made a B. Took another class. I ended up with 15 college credits. A counselor said, you have 15 college credits. You can bypass the SAT. If you want to go to the University of Houston, let's apply. Everything is free. I applied, and the University of Houston accepted me. And despite having a very promising military career, I decided I'm going to get out, and I'm going to try to get a college degree so I can prove that counselor wrong. So that's why I decided to get out, because I wanted to go and get a college degree, and I wanted to prove him wrong. Yes?
Do you ever think you'll ever go back?
To the military?
Yeah.
No, well, I'm 56 years old, and so I'm just too old.
Oh.
There was a time after I got my master's degree that I wanted to re-enlist as an officer, but it was a different time. They were actually laying off soldiers because it was during a peaceful time. I even thought that I wanted to do something Army-like joining the FBI, and so I applied. I got deep into the process. They called me and they said, we need you to go to, I think it was Kansas City, Missouri, to the interview part. If you do well in the interview part, you have to commit to going to Quantico within a few months. I thought, you know, I don't really want to go back into a military type of life. Even though I thought that I did, I kind of did my time. I served with honor, and I just kind of want to go and be a civilian. So I did think about it, but after a while, I decided that I wanted to be a soldier, or rather a civilian. Very good question. Very good question. Yes.
Is military police like a regular police?
Absolutely. Yes. And so, depending on where you're stationed, because the military is self-sufficient, meaning a civilian police force doesn't have jurisdiction, yes, I was a police officer. I drove in a police car. I could write tickets. I could arrest individuals. So I was a regular police officer. But at the same time, I was a soldier first. So when I got deployed, I was basically a police officer for the base, but I still did recon missions. I secured the post, and if it hit the fan, you know, I'm a soldier. Everybody's a soldier. That's why you have to go to basic training. If you're a paper pusher, guess what? When the bullets start flying, you're a soldier. So yes, I was a regular police officer, But whenever I was deployed with a combat unit, and I basically did combat-like soldier things. Very good question. Okay, yes.
Did you go to college out of resentment for that counselor?
To a certain degree, yes. Yes, I just wanted to prove that I could go to college. I just wanted to prove that that I am somebody. I am college material. So yes. More questions. More questions. All right, this brings me to my third and final point, the outcomes. Not only did I get a bachelor's degree, but I ended up getting a master's degree. Sounds great, but I will not lie. I got out in 2 years and 10 months. If you notice that 10 months, they were kicking people out of the Army. They asked me, are you going to re-enlist? Because I signed up for 3 years. I was due to get out in September. And I said, no, I'm gonna get out and go to college. And so they goes, okay, if that's the case, you need to go now. And so I got out late July, and I started the University of Houston 3 weeks later. Culture shock. So the first class, University of Houston, history, 300 students in the class. 300 students in the class. I could barely see the board. My next class was algebra, and I thought this will be a smaller class because algebra is hard. It's really hard. It was 250 people. We were doing algebra in an auditorium. My next class was my communication class. It was 100 individuals. And finally, I had my English class where we broke out into pods of 25. That first week I was overwhelmed. I literally went straight from the military to the University of Houston because you know how laid back college is, but I was used to a very structured environment in the United States Army. So this laid back, do whatever you wanted to do, just kind of party, I was not used to that. That first week I thought, I can't handle this. I'm gonna go back and go be a soldier again. But I stopped and thought, can I go to the University of Houston? Because I didn't think I was college material. I just think I could do it. But I thought, look, you had the discipline, you had the money. You've proven that you've been able to do things that you never thought you could do. Can you go to the University of Houston every single day, try your hardest, and make C minuses? Because that's all I had to do. I just needed a degree. And yes, I was able to make at least C minuses. I ended up getting a 4-year degree in 3 years, and I graduated with a 3.02 GPA. And I was very proud because I ultimately wanted to have a 3.0. Yes.
Did your dyslexia ever affect your college work in any way?
So by that time, no. By that time, I realized this is what it is, deal with it. You know, in the Army, I would march, my whole foot would be a blister. I just couldn't say, time out, I can't march. You get a pen, you heat it up, you drain the pus, and you march. So I got the discipline, and that discipline of, you know what, it's raining outside, it sucks, I'm in the mud, tough, deal with it. I haven't slept in 3 days, deal with it. And so in the University of Houston, I have dyslexia, deal with it. This is life. So at that point, I realized that this is life, I have to deal with it. So it did not impact me. Very good question. Come time for my master's degree, basically the reason why I got a master's is because, I didn't think I was gonna get a master's. I'm just happy for a bachelor's. My college professor said, look, everything is paid for because you're in the military. So I didn't have to pay for any college. Everything in the University of Houston was paid for. I didn't pay for any books, any tuition, was all paid for. And you are a wonderful communication student. You make the highest grades, even on your written papers. You're the best public speaker that I've heard. Go and get a master's. A master's degree. Keep in mind, a couple of years later, or before, I didn't think that I was college material, but I had a bachelor's, and I ended up getting a master's degree. And basically, I wrote my master's degree, because it took me a little bit longer. It took me 4 years because I was working, but I wrote my thesis from start to finish in 11 months, 150 pages. A book, it's basically a book. If you go to the University of Houston and you go to the red floor, that's where they kept the thesi back then, you would see mine, and then you could look at thesi behind it. People used my thesis for their research, and that's the very point of doing research, so other people can use it. And so not only did I get a bachelor's degree, but I ultimately got a master's degree. My recommendation is, when you have a decision to make, think on the events that you have, make the right decision, so that the outcomes will be positive like they were for me getting a bachelor's and a master's degree. Before I move on to my conclusion, are there any questions? Any questions? Yes.
What was your thesis on?
Very good question. My thesis was basically on the public relations campaign to end slavery. And so there's a gentleman, can't recall his name by now, but he basically said that an individual that tells the most believable story will be the individual that is believed. You remember I told you earlier on that we all like to hear stories. And so your little boy, little girl, you break a jar. Well, what happened? The Cookie Monster came in and just threw it down. You know, that's not a really believable story. The characters aren't believable. The setting doesn't match up. So as it pertains to ending slavery, at one point, people that were for slavery said Negroes were not human beings. They weren't worthy to be treated like human beings. That was the prevailing story. But eventually the abolitionists came along and they started a new story. Black people are human beings. They can be productive. They can contribute to society in a positive way. They literally turned the tide in the Civil War. The 54th Massachusetts Buffalo Soldiers, they called them Buffalo Soldiers. The Native Americans actually called them Buffalo Soldiers because of the afro. They literally helped change the tide of the Civil War so that the North ultimately could win. And so my thesis showed how the the pro-slavery narrative eventually was overtaken by the the anti-slavery narrative so that slavery could be ended. Very good question. Very good question. More questions. More questions. All righty, in conclusion, I told you about 3 points. Point number 1, the events that caused me to join the military, where my mom said I'd leave the house when I was 18 years old, and I did not do very well on my SAT test. Point number 2, the decision, me actually being in the military, where I was miserable because I washed a bunch of dishes, but I did get to fire an M16, which I thought was cool. And then the outcome where I got a bachelor's degree as well as a master's degree. What I want you to take away from this presentation is you will have to make major decisions that will impact your life. Think and project what the outcomes will be based on the events so that you make the right decision so that you can also be productive. You've been a wonderful audience. Thank you very much.